My name is Frank Moran, and I live in Douglasville, Georgia, small town to the west of Atlanta.
How long have you been in Douglasville?
We've been living here about 30 years now.
And who's we?
My wife and two children. Now, my oldest is married. She's been away from home for 20 years. And my youngest is a special needs child. And so she lives with us.
Okay. And what's your wife's name?
Gwen,
I think when I talked to you the other day, you said you were getting close to, was it 57 or 60 years?
it'll be 57 in December.
57 years. Wow. In December. So just
I can't remember when I wasn't married. And she normally says, "You lucky dog."
yeah. Yeah. Well, it's good to be reminded now and then. Um so where did you didn't grow up in Georgia? You don't sound like you grew up in Georgia. Where'd you grow
No,
up?
I grew up in New Hampshire. And I don't know if you're familiar with the area, but I grew up in a town called Manchester. It's
Mhm.
the largest city in New Hampshire, but it's primarily a factory town, or at least it was when I was growing up. So in those days, scholarships were not readily available for anyone. And we grew up rather poor, even though we didn't know it, because everybody else around us was just like us. And most of our parents were factory workers. I got to work in a factory between my junior and senior year in high school and decided that that was not going to be a career for me or something that I wanted to do. And not having any funds or scholarship. So the only thing you really had in those days when you graduated from high school, the expectations were that you were going to leave home and you could either go to college and or work in the factory or go in the army.
Hmm. And
So college,
what year was this that you graduated from high school?
63.
63.
It, I graduated on the 16th of June in 63. On the 26th of June, I reported for basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey.
Wow, you didn't waste any time.
Well, I had taken some preliminary tests, Michael, in February, and had taken some aptitude tests, and they had me generated toward. And there was a thing called a buddy program at that time, and two guys from the same town or the same unit could go into the military at the same time. And I did go in with another individual who I'd gone through high school with.
And what was the point of this buddy program? Did it mean that you guys would be somehow stuck together through basic or beyond? Well, what was the
They
point
were
of?
it meant that we were going to be in the same basic training company because
Hmm.
in those days the companies were set up alphabetically, and his last name was a V and mine was an M. So he was in the fourth platoon and I was in the third platoon, but we were in the same basic training company.
Got it. So the buddy program was just so that you would have somebody
Yeah,
in basic training.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. I'm curious how important was that for you? I mean, how did that change your
Yeah,
basic
it
experience?
was because if you're familiar with the area that I grew up in, it was one heck of a culture shock for me. I had grown up in the Catholic parochial school system, and hardly in New Hampshire in those days there was very few black men. And when I joined, when I got to Fort Dix that night at midnight, half of my platoons was from Harlem, and they had brought their own weapons. So they had zip guns and knuckles. I mean, and this was the culture that they were accustomed to.
Sure.
But yeah, it was a very big culture. So having somebody there that I knew was okay.
Okay, good. So when you finished basic, where'd you go then?
I went to Fort Holabird, Maryland. That was at that time the military intelligence school, and I picked up an MOS, a military occupation specialty of 9-2 Bravo, which was an intelligence operations analyst, and specifically in order of battle.
I'm sorry, can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, it was called intelligence specialist, and specified in a term called order of battle. And basically, it was that you kept track of enemy units as an intelligence field, how you got to it. And at that school, I learned how to do it, and then I was immediately transferred to Germany in December of that year.
And we're still talking about 63.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah. And I was assigned to the 7th Army as a in military intelligence in the 504th Military Intelligence Detachment, and we were attached to the 4th Armored Division in southern Germany.
Okay. And how long were you there?
I stayed there for about 3.5 years. And then I got the opportunity to go to the 7th Army NCO Academy in Bad Tolz, Germany, where I was the honor graduate. So then I was 19 years old and I was a sergeant.
Wow.
And I looked
So
around
what
and I
do you
said,
attribute your meteoric rise through the enlisted ranks?
well, the fact that I was the honor graduate, that was part of if you went to that academy, and it was about a 3-week long academy, and you were the honor graduate, then you were automatically promoted to sergeant, to E5 sergeant.
19.
19.
Wow.
It gets a little
So,
better though.
so you're a 19-year-old sergeant in
Yep,
somewhere in southern Germany,
that's
uh,
correct.
in Bavaria, I would imagine.
Yeah, it was in a town called Gerpingen,
Mm-hmm.
and Gerpingen is 40 kilometers to the west of Stuttgart. And Stuttgart's a major city in the south of Germany. That's where they make
Yeah.
Porsches.
So you're pretty near the Black Forest.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So how long do you stay in Germany as a 19-year-old sergeant?
Well, after I made sergeant, it wasn't too much longer because I looked around and I said, the Army's not too bad. I'm getting 3 hots and a cot and a little pay. And I said, it's not bad at all, but I think I would like to be an officer.
Mm-hmm.
So I applied to go to officer candidate school. So in August of 66, I got transferred to Fort Benning, Georgia to attend officer candidate school.
Now, for people who are not familiar, I think there's a general perception that in order to be an officer, you have to have a college degree. Even
That's
to go to OCS, you have to. Is that not the case?
I don't know what the rules are now, Michael, but at that time, you got to figure we were gearing up for war, and so the college was not really a necessity or a requirement that you attend.
Sure. I mean, by then you had 4 years of experience in the Army, so or close to
Yeah,
it. So
yeah.
that counted.
And there
For
was a few guys like me who'd gone there, but there was a bunch that had never done anything in the Army. They went straight from basic training to that element. But there are several of us who were E5s that had been there for around it. And the military portion was a little easier for us because we understood.
So where did they send you for OCS once you were accepted?
I went to Fort Benning, Georgia.
Okay. And what was that like, that experience?
It was 6 months of, well, I'll tell you, let me put it this way. When I graduated in March of 67, I told my wife that I would not go through this again if they made me a colonel. So it was a pretty rough experience for 6 months. I mean, they were teaching you a lot of tactics, a lot of things to do as an infantry officer. But I got to tell you, in the long run, it was very good training that probably helped me survive through Vietnam.
Hmm.
Now, a lot of it was Mickey Mouse and BS stuff that they do just to see if you're going to persevere and how you're going to act under stress. And that part was not comfortable at all. But in the long run, it was really great to get commissioned, and it just kicked me up another little level. So now I'm 21 and 2 months and a lieutenant.
And is there, excuse me, are there any other stops between Fort Benning and Vietnam?
Yes, I was stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, for 6 months. I was an executive officer in a basic training company.
A basic training company.
Yeah.
Okay.
We had my CO was a guy named Lieutenant York, and I was his executive officer, and we ran a basic training company in Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize maybe it was different then. I always associate Fort Campbell with 101st. I didn't think it was.
They were also there on that base, but they had a bunch of basic training, and they had a few other little units.
Okay. Okay.
But you're right, that was the home of the 101st.
Yeah. So how long were you in Fort Campbell?
I was there for about well, I got there in April of 67 and I left in October. So about 6 months.
Yeah. Yeah. So by then, I mean, April to October of 67, there's a there's a growing demand for officers, infantry
Coming up.
officers
Yeah.
in Vietnam. And I
Yeah.
wonder whether you got caught up in that, or did you jump in willingly?
Well, I knew being an infantry officer that you were going to end up there in a month. I mean, when they did the training at Fort Benning, it was assumed that within somewhere after your first year of being commissioned, you were going to be in Vietnam. And
Mm.
that was the assumption.
Mhm.
In October of 67, I received orders to go to jungle school in Panama as a prep to going to Vietnam. And I actually landed in Vietnam in the first week of December of 67.
Wow. Uh, is there anything you want to say about jungle school?
Yeah, it was we never lived in a barracks or anything. We lived in the field the entire time in the jungle, and it was a very big learning experience. You know, not ever having lived in the jungle before, and you learned the things that you could eat and could not eat. You learned how to rappel down waterfalls. You learned how to do navigation, you know, where there was a lot of water. I got to swim across the Chagres River. The Chagres River is what feeds the Panama Canal to allow the ships to get up and down.
Mm.
So that was part of the training, that you had to build a little uh, poncho lined sticks and stuff to help you float across the river.
Okay. How well do you think that prepared you for the environment in Vietnam in terms of just
I
being wet
think it
and fighting
showed me,
bugs and snakes
yeah,
and whatnot?
I think that it showed me that the jungle was pretty neutral, and the more you knew about it, then the more you could use it to your advantage. There were some things in Panama that I never saw in Vietnam, but there were some things in Vietnam that I never saw in Panama either. For instance, I remember distinctly because it was pretty painful. They have a pine tree that has very sharp needles. In fact, a lot of the Panamanians actually use it to sew. But if you're moving around at night and you hit that tree, it'll stick inside of you. And because of the temperature and the humidity in Panama and also in Vietnam, yeah, and infections are very quick.
Mm. Hmm.
So there was some similarities that helped you get you. We actually hit the monsoons when we were in Panama. So when I hit the monsoons in the Delta, I knew exactly what that was and how to try to maneuver it. But there wasn't much you can do. You just got wet and you stayed wet all day.
Yeah. So December of 67, you arrive in Vietnam. You've got a wife by then for sure.
Yes.
Any kids?
No, no. It was a little short of our first anniversary. My anniversary was December of 17th of 66.
Hmm.
And then this is an anecdote. Um, I was going to take my future wife home to New England to meet my family. And her mama said, "Well, you're not going anywhere overnight until you're married." So we got married on December 17th, and then we took it. So
Yeah.
that's that story. But you know,
And
folks
where's she
said,
from?
"Well,
Where's she from?
she was a military brat. Her dad was an NCO in the army,
Okay.
and she was originally from Missouri, that St. Louis area."
Okay. Okay. So she wasn't somebody you met down south.
No, actually, I met her in Germany.
Hmm.
I was moonlighting when I was an enlisted man, and I worked at the NCO club serving drinks. And she was playing bingo with her mom, and I met her there, and we started dating. And then they got transferred to Fort Benning about the same time I did, so we got married. And
Yeah.
we were planning to do that anyways.
Yeah. So you said that you know, it was no surprise to you. You knew that within a year of being commissioned as an infantry officer, you'd be in Vietnam. So she must have known this too.
Oh
How
yeah, yeah,
how
she
did she
knew it.
feel about it?
Well, you know, like most newlyweds, I mean, you know, you don't. That's not the ideal place. I think it was rough for, and by the way, she was only 19 at that time.
Mm.
So it's kind of rough to watch your husband go off after you've only been together for, a little less than a year. We dated for a while, about a year before we got married. So, 2 years and here goes your husband. And I think, reality set in, and I'll get closer into that. There was pretty good communications once I got there. I mean, we'd write to each other, and probably every 2 or 3 days I'd get a letter and she'd get one similar. But when Tet hit, we went 4 weeks without any mail. And that was very tough for her because she didn't know what was happening and had no understanding, and hearing all the stories on the news and stuff.
Well, I think that's really important, right? To, if we can dig into that for a minute, because when you arrived in December of 67, it was right before a major turning point, and not only in the war, but in terms of how it was being reported and perceived at home. So it was one thing for her it was one thing for her in December of 67 to wave goodbye to you. It was another thing after Tet, or when Tet hit, for her to be turning on the television and not hearing from you.
Absolutely. Yeah, and her mind wasn't really reconciled to the fact that I was okay until I met with her in May of that year when I was on R&R. We went to Hawaii and met with her.
In which month?
May.
Okay. So let's go back to December. Tell me what you remember about arriving in Vietnam. Where did you land, and what were your first impressions?
I landed in Saigon in Tan Son Nhut. That's where most of the folks went. And I got bused to a divisional camp, which was called Bearcat. And Bearcat was the headquarters for the 9th Infantry Division at that time. And you spent 3 days getting acclimatized to the weather, and you go out on a few patrols. But that was it. After about 3 days, then they shipped you to the unit that you were going to be with. So then they put me on a Caribou aircraft, and I flew south to actually it was an Americanized post that they called Dong Tam. And at that time, Dong Tam was the headquarters for the 2nd Brigade, which was the Army element of the Mobile Riverine Force. Mm-hmm. The 2nd Brigade had 3 battalions in it. The 4th of the 47th, which I belonged to, the 3rd of the 47th, and the 3rd of the 60th. So there was 3 battalions associated with the 2nd Brigade.
Yeah. How long had the Mobile Riverine Force been operating in that area by the time you got there?
When I got there, they were ending their first year of being there. They got there in January of 66. And Michael, that brings up an interesting point. They were rotating, the tour of duty for an Army guy in those days. I think the Marine was 13 months, but the Army was 12. Mm-hmm. Was 12 months. So if they got there in January, a lot of them were leaving in December and January of 68, right before Tet. They were gone. Mm-hmm. So I was probably one of the filler-uppers for that first annual rotation. So I got there in December, anticipation that I was going to fill a slot in the unit in January for somebody who was leaving.
Yeah, and they had gone over together as a unit.
Yes. Yeah.
So you're arriving, and not only have they been in Vietnam all together for a year, but they probably trained together, they traveled together. Like these guys have a long, relative to a replacement, they've got a long history of being together. So you're brand new, you're not surrounded by guys you've known for a year or two. And so you have that to overcome. And then you also have the fact that this type of operation, Mobile Riverine Force, is probably new to you. And then on top of that, you have Tet.
Yeah, well, Tet was going to come. I got into several firefights way before Tet.
Yeah.
The first time I got shot at, I'd been in country 6 days. 3 days in Bearcat, and then the 3rd day in that I was assigned to my unit.
Wow.
And you talk, one of the issues that you were trying, I guess, to generate to is, what's the acceptance of a new guy into the unit, especially a new lieutenant. Well, one of the things that's helpful, I think, sometimes is if you have a sense of humor. And I will tell you that the first time I got shot at, you kind of learn when you're in basic training and actually in an infantry school that if you're getting shot at, you try to get behind something and shoot around it. Well, when I got into Vietnam, I didn't know a lot about the terrain and stuff, so I hid behind a banana tree. Now, if you're familiar at all with a banana tree, you can walk over and knock it over with your hand. All it is a bunch of leaves filled with water or moisture. So that bullet would have gone right through it. But I was able to laugh about that, and my troops were, and that made it easier for them to accept me, to say, look, he's got a sense of humor about it, and he's not going to go crazy over it.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And the other thing was, and that I did and allowed me to, we were pulling what I call berm duty. Berm is the circular around the base camp. And it was our duty on Christmas Eve to be guarding that particular berm. I had a whole section of it, and my platoon was guarding that berm. So I took the opportunity. I had a Jeep, and we had gotten some stuff from the Red Cross, and I gave it. I put it in the Jeep, and me and the Jeep driver drove around to all my positions, and we gave little bags that had toothbrushes and toothpaste and pencils and playing cards and the stuff that was given up. And that was a Christmas present that they were getting, that I was running it around to do that. So, you know, there's an element of being able to contact people and to do stuff for them and with them. And that not only endears you to them, and then as you get knowing them for a little while, they begin to develop confidence in your skill set and the ability of the things that you're going to do. So, initially, I think the new guy, it takes a while for him to hook up with the other guys and talk. But after a while, you're always looking out for each other. And I had to depend on them looking out for me. So then you get together and you kind of build a friendship and a body.
Can you talk a little bit about your early experience on the boats, on the tangos, working with the Navy, and how, if at all, that changed with Tet?
I had on the boats for about 2 weeks before Tet, and we had just then we moved into base camp. And what happened, Michael, is there was a rotation. There was always 2 battalions on the boats, and the 3rd battalion guarded the base camp for Dong Tam. So you had 6 weeks that you were on land and 12 weeks that you were on boats. And there was a rotation that went on there. One battalion would come off and then be the guard, then the other battalion would go on. So I got off the boats right a week before Christmas, and that's when we were pulling berm duty around the post at Christmas Eve. So I was not on boats during Tet. We were running operations from the base camp. And in those cases, you would fly out in helicopters, or you just walk out to the operations around your base. So for me, the experience of during Tet was, we used to do something called Eagle flights. And Eagle flights had like a platoon, 2 or 3 helicopters, and you'd go fly and you'd land in an area and walk around and stuff and see if you could find somebody or something. And then if you didn't, after a couple hours, they'd come and extract you with the helicopters. And that was called Eagle flights.
Okay. When was the first time that you really remember? I'm not sure even how to phrase this question. I mean, at some point, the presence of the Navy and that operational interdependency that you had must have made itself really apparent to you, right? I mean, this is not a typical Army experience. It's the first time since the Civil War,
in fact,
right?
It was very brief, but it was right there when I got in country after I got done with Bearcat. I was actually assigned on a boat for about 2 weeks before we got off. So my first interaction was right there, within a week and a half to 10 days after I actually landed in country. And it's a whole new environment. And I got to tell you, as a lieutenant, the tendency for us is to get got along a lot better with their Navy chiefs. And because we're used to dealing with our NCOs and being and talking to them and talking to our men and being part of it. And then, if they have a function, even if it's a crappy function, we're there with them. I filled sandbags with my troops when I asked them to fill them out, because the issue at Benning was always lead by example. That's what we learned, and that's what we always do. And that again goes back to your question a few minutes ago, Michael, about how you get accepted. If you're part of them and they feel that you're part of them and you're going to help them out, then they're going to be a lot more receptive to your leadership. Mm-hmm. So, to me, there was a dichotomy between the officers on the ships, on the Navy, on the boats, and now going back to your initial question, there was no college requirement for the Army to go to officer candidate school. Most of the Navy officers had a college degree, and that's how they got commissioned. Now, not all of them went to Annapolis, but they had ways to get commissioned. But as a general rule, a lot of those guys had a degree. So there was a division there. There was a division that was that there were two types of the Navy officers that I dealt with. There were one that we call ship's company, and they actually ran the boats and they ran the supplies on the boats and all the rest of those stuff. And then there was a group of officers who were much closer to us, and those are the guys that commanded the chiefs who commanded the little boats that carried us up and down the river. So they operated on a special boat called a CCB. It was a command and control boat. And that's how they gave directions to their men to move the little boats, the armored troop carriers, which is what had the infantry platoon in it. Are you familiar with that boat at all, Michael?
Yeah, I am. I know that it's called, they were called tangos.
Yeah, the Navy called them tangos. We call them armed troop carriers.
So you didn't call them tangos?
No.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, there's how they had a number on the boats, and they're like Tango 117 was one of the RIV divisions that we worked with.
Mm-hmm. And how many troops could a tango accommodate?
Roughly a platoon. It's in a platoon. We had this discussion the other day, but a platoon, a full loaded platoon, was about 43 men. I never had that many men in my platoon. I think the most I ever had was 28.
Wow. So just over half strength.
Yeah. And that was not uncommon because of the rotation. If you remember that the bulk of them, so they couldn't rotate everybody at the same time. And it worked out a little better that you would get, one guy every 2 weeks or two guys in 1 week, and that you'd rebuild that way. And that way you had a time for the new guys to adapt to the old guys to learn the things to do. And then, of course, you lost some through combat, through injuries, through illnesses. And so then those guys had to be replaced too.
Are there any particular operations that you want to talk about, just so listeners and viewers can understand what the job itself was like at that time in that place?
Yeah, let's talk about the operations on the tangos. I'll just give you the way I remember it. Basically, the night before you went out, probably around 6 or 7 o'clock, you got a briefing by your company commander, basically saying, we're going to go into this area. Here's a map of the operation, and here's what your platoon is going to be responsible for. And he would give out assignments to each of the 3 platoon leaders that he had. We would get up generally 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, pending how far away our drop station was going to be. And we would actually load the tango when it was dark. And then we would travel. We'd obviously leave Dongtam or wherever the boats were based. We would leave the large boats, which was always in the Mekong River. And they were probably generally a mile offshore, so they couldn't be shot at. So we would get onto the little boats, and then we'd slowly go up and down the canals and until we reached the point where we were going to do an objective. And then they would beach, they would drop the ramp, and we would get off the beach, and then we would continue our operation. And it usually was some kind of circular operation. You went, in a couple of kilometers and came back around, and you were out there generally for 2.5 to 3 days. And because we were always in the water, you had to come back and dry out. And so after about two or 3 days, then the boats would come back. You'd reload the boats and go back onto the main ships. So in essence, that was the extent of a riverine operation from a platoon leader level.
Yeah, I understand. Are there any specific ones that stand
Well,
out
yeah,
in your memory?
there's some places that whenever you heard the name, you knew it was going to be some kind of problem. There was one that there's a couple of them that I'll discuss with you. One is called Snoopy's Nose, and anybody who was ever on a boat knows about Snoopy's Nose. And what happened there, Michael, is the nose, if you would, is a little, let's say, 3/4 circle. All right, and when your ship is coming in on the bottom of the circle, they're going to allow you to go to a certain part to go back to the top. Now you got a string of boats going all the way from the bottom of the circle to the top. So they put one or two guys in the middle. He starts shooting at the bottom one. The bottom one has the Navy with 50 caliber guns that can shoot. This thing was probably about a kilometer or a kilometer and a half, as far as big as it was. So he starts shooting at the boat at the bottom. The Navy on the top has got 50 caliber, so they're shooting at that noise, and now those bullets are hitting the convoy that's up on the top.
Mm-hmm.
So it just creates havoc. So you knew you were going to, and so we learned over time that was going to happen, and the Navy learned a good gun discipline and would not shoot once they get shot at. So they wouldn't shoot and shot each other. So that was one of the interesting. There was a thing. There was a place called the Crossroads, and Crossroads was next to a town called Bentre, Bentre, 2 words. And I don't remember a time going there where we didn't really get shot at and severely wounded. On one of those operations, in I think it was April the 8th, I lost 8 men on that operation. What happened, Michael, is that when they beached us, there was a machine gun waiting, and you're extremely vulnerable when you're inside that little boat, and you're trying to get out, and bullets and stuff and shrapnel was flying all over the place. So I lost 8 men on an operation there in, I think it was April the 8th. It was early April in '68.
All of them, you lost all of them on the beach?
Yeah, just before we got off, as we were trying to get off.
Yeah.
And it's not a beach like you see, when you go to the beach. What it is like a wall of mud, and immediately 5 feet across are giant trees and mango swamps and all sorts of different things, depending on where they beached you.
Right.
Usually they would beach you and they'd back off a little bit so they could drop the ramp so it would be flat. But I mean, you walked off, you were in mud, so you weren't moving very fast anyways. And then you're very vulnerable if you're inside the well deck of one of these boats.
Yeah. And for people who aren't familiar with the boats, I mean, these are similar to the boats that everybody knows from Saving Private Ryan, right? With the ramp.
Yeah,
Ramp that opens up.
they called them LSTs during World War II. This was a miniature version, and midway through my tour, they started putting platforms on top of them where literally you could land a helicopter on them. Mm-hmm. Which was kind of a neat thing, because it could be a lifesaver if you had guys on your boat that had gotten hit or whatever. They could land that helicopter right on top of it and take off from there.
Yeah, it's just amazing to me that such a heavily fortified boat, weighed down with so much firepower and reinforcement, could also support the weight of a helicopter.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Still float.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but they're very sturdy. They were strong boats. They were well built. A lot of styrofoam to float them that goes inside the walls. The helicopters aren't that heavy. I flew them for a while, and if you hover just right, they're pretty light. You literally, if I was hovering, you could take one of the skids and turn the helicopter around on itself without any problem. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it's not that they're that light, but the air and everything is taken care of, the weight problem.
Sure. You mentioned you mentioned Snoopy's nose, and that reminded me that, you know, when you describe a typical operation, right, getting up at 2 or 3 in the morning, loading the tangos, traveling upriver, you know, through the canals or whatever, um, the trip itself is often eventful, right?
Oh, yeah, without
It's
question.
not just
There were
when you get
several
to your,
times.
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I interrupted you. What were you going to say, Michael?
Well, it's not just that, you know, the action starts when you get off the boat. I mean, the action starts the minute you
Get
start
on.
sailing upriver. Yeah, you're in the brown water.
Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't every time, but it wasn't unoften either that you would draw fire as you were going up the canal. And you know, depending on how big the force was that was shooting against you, sometimes it was just a sniper or two. Sometimes you had a company or something that would fire at you. And then the boat driver would, and that's probably not, that's the Army term for him. They probably got a much more sophisticated, but the boat driver had to make a decision on him whether he was going to pull out of there or he was going to beat you.
Mm.
Because you know, if he's drawing fire, then one of the way you stop it, you beach and go after him. Now, if you're far enough away from the side, if you're in the middle of a giant canal, for instance, that's got 200 or 300 meters across, then you might just kind of stay there and wait around and see what's happening. But you know, or you might back off and call in artillery or gunships and say, you know, right over to my flank of this boat here, I'm getting some fire.
Mm.
So there were different ways of operating. And actually, I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but the flotilla that we were attached to had two boats called the Zippos. And what they had done, they had taken the well decks out of these things and put giant napalm canister in it. And they had on each side in the front would throw out a flame about 400 meters. So oftentimes it would come up the canals right before us, and if they drew fire, then they'd throw the Zippo out
Just to clear the jungle.
there. Yeah, when to stop whoever the heck was shooting at you. If
Yeah.
you got a bunch of fire coming at you, you're going to stop.
Yeah. Well, I was familiar with that term, but I had no
Okay,
idea that the flame it threw was 400 meters.
that's what I was told. I would never start around, but that's about it. Yeah.
I mean, that is mind-boggling. That is a pretty huge swath of
Oh
destruction.
yeah.
What what was it like just mechanically to work with the Navy? Because you know, you're two separate branches, you got two separate, I mean, I know you're all working as one kind of combined force, but there must have been times that it was either made easier or more difficult than usual, uh that you had two different ways of doing things.
Without question, I always felt, Michael, that maybe a better tactical maneuver for the war would have been to put the Marines with him, since they were so much used to working with the Navy. They understood starboard versus port, and you know, we had that stuff that we had to learn. We didn't even know that. You know, the only way I remember port was that it had a four letters, and that's equal to left, and that's how they taught me how to do it. You know, but and all those things about, you know, they have different little sayings that they do on the ships and the way they operate and how they keep it all clean and the things that they're responsible for doing. um, so there's very different things that occur. I think there was a giant mutual respect, especially for the troops that went with us. Those that were on that stayed on the boats, they were okay, you know, they were doing a job. But those that came with us and actually drove the little boats and commanded those little boats had a lot of respect, and I think they had quite a bit of respect for us. I'll give you an incident that I remember. We had one of our guys screw up pretty bad, and the guy on a boat, the ship's captain is allowed to punish you for whatever you do. I mean, they hold the Uniform Code of Military Justice and they can punish you. Well, one of the punishments that they can do in the Navy still was to put you on bread and water. Now, our guys were Army. We don't have that in our Uniform Code of Military Justice. So when that guy tried to impose it on our guy, our commander went back and said, no, we're going to have to find a different way because that's not in our. So that's going by way of telling you that there are some differences mechanically and administratively that the two branches do different. But I would say overall, I think there was just a tremendous amount of how do we work this out together to make it come out good for both of us.
Yeah. Are there any particular Navy guys who you remember very clearly?
Yeah, one of the boats that I was on had a dentist. And growing in New Hampshire, you get nasty teeth because they didn't have fluoride water when I was growing up. So he and I used to play chess together, and he took me on, and he quartered my mouth and fixed up all my teeth while I was there. You know, he would do a quarter of my mouth at a time. So every couple of weeks when I was on the ship, then he'd have me come in and he'd fix it up. So yes, I did enjoy that very much.
Yeah. So I know it's typical for a combat infantry platoon leader to get rotated into some sort of staff position after 6
Yes.
months or so. Did that happen for you?
Yes, it happened in May of '67, right after I got back from R&R. I was put on the staff. I was the intelligence officer for the battalion.
You mean
I was the S2.
You mean May of '68?
Yeah, May of '68. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. And so at the end of your tour in Vietnam, was there any thought to coming back for a second tour?
No.
No.
I think,
You had a wife at
I
home.
remained in the Army for an additional 4 years, and had somebody said, a year into it, that I would go back, I would never have turned it down. I didn't believe in that. I took orders. I joined the military, and I knew, understanding that there was some issue, there was combat going on, that somebody sent me. It wasn't something that I would volunteer for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you remember about coming home?
For me, it wasn't that traumatic, other than I was going to get to see my wife, who I hadn't seen in a year. And when you're 22, that's pretty important.
Sure.
I landed in Oakland. I was there a whole hour and a half. Got onto another aircraft and went to St. Louis, and that's what my wife was living there with her parents at the time.
Gotcha. Now, didn't you mention something about R&R earlier in the conversation?
Yeah, I went after I got out of the field, on my way to the staff. In between that, I went to R&R and met my wife. You're right. In May, we went to Hawaii. We met in Hawaii.
And how long was that? Usually a week or 2 weeks?
A week. It was exactly 1 week.
Exactly 1 week.
Yeah.
I've been thinking we should do an episode just with R&R stories, right?
Oh yeah, that would be great. A lot of our guys went all over the place. I remember Australia.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of guys came back. Cambodia, Thailand was a big one. Bangkok, and Hong Kong. Those were the three that my guys usually chose. If they were married, invariably their wife expected them to go to Hawaii, and they were going to meet them there. But if they weren't married, then they would go to those. Those were the three that I saw, that I heard and saw most of going.
Mm. What do you remember about your week in Hawaii? I mean, without getting too personal, like just psychologically, what was it like to have to shift gears and then shift back again within a week?
Yeah, I'm not even sure there was really a big shift. I think, when I got in Hawaii, I was still thinking about my troops and things that had happened. And I think when I was on my way back, I was thinking about Hawaii and my wife. So there was a difference of, what just happened to me. I'm thinking about that right now. And the week is pretty short. Midway through the week, then you kind of shift gears and say, okay, let me enjoy this time that I have with my wife. Let's go out and have a nice dinner. Let's go see a couple of shows. And then knowing that, in 3 days, I'm going to have to hug her and say goodbye again, or, at the end of the week. I guess, Michael, maybe I'm not that smart to have all this psychology working for me. It's just that impromptu, it happens, and and then I try to do the best of it. What's happening? There wasn't a lot of forethought of, okay, I'm going back now. What does that mean? And there was a little bit of excitement on my part because I had just left the field. So I was going into a new position that I hadn't done before.
Gotcha. So when you were with the Mobile Riverine Force, uh, you were, and forgive me, there's been a lot of dates and facts that I'm trying to kind of pull up from memory, but you were what, about 22?
I was 22. I turned 22 on January the 24th in 68.
Yeah. So you're a 22-year-old combat infantry platoon leader.
Yeah, I was a second lieutenant when I turned 22. And in March, I became first lieutenant.
Now, I mean, how did that compare with the other platoon leaders in terms of age? Were you about the same, or were you relatively younger?
I think those who had done a little bit of college, if not graduated, were older because they had that 4-year span of education that I didn't have. But I had 4 years of military, so they were pretty close to me. I think on the average platoon leader was probably, I'm going to say, somewhere between 22 and maybe 26.
So what was the age difference between you and the men that you led?
That's an interesting thing. There was a time when I was in Vietnam in February of 68. Well, I had just turned 22 and I was the oldest guy in my rifle platoon. So they were all 18, 19, 20, and 21. And it's interesting, a big part of Vietnam was helicopter pilots. And a lot of those guys were under 20. They were warrant officers. And, you give a kid who's 20 years old an airplane to fly with guns on it, it's like in the movies. But a lot of those guys, were our age.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about the association and the reunions, and how it was that you got involved with that initially. But one of the things that I noticed in St. Louis when I attended the reunion there, I mean, if you look at it, let's just take a Tango boat, right, as a model. You've got potentially 40 guys in the well deck in Army uniforms, and maybe what, 8 or 10 guys up above in Navy
Yep.
uniforms.
Yep.
So it's a lot more Army than Navy in this Mobile Riverine Force. But when I go to the reunion in St. Louis, it's way more Navy than Army.
Yeah, I think a lot of the Army guys, for many of them got wounded, obviously, and hurt a lot more than the Navy on a ratio basis, although some of those guys got hurt pretty bad.
Mm.
And I think we probably had more draftees because in those days, if you had an opportunity, you would choose something that wasn't infantry. There wasn't many guys who want to say, there's a bunch. I mean, there's some that wanted to. So a lot of our guys were draftees and had no intentions of going to the military, but they got there. But once they got there, they said, okay, I've done my tour. I'm all finished. I don't have any desire to continue my relationship with the military or anything that has to do with the military. So I think that's part of it.
Hmm. And how long was it between your exit from the military and your the start of your association with the association?
Well, I was out of the Army for 7, 8 years before I started hearing stuff about it. And there was a man that I knew in Georgia, and he's the one who told me about it. And he said, you ought to go online and apply. And there's a lot of our guys talking about stuff. And for a while I said no, and then I went, and I found it pretty interesting. But if I go on the Riverine Force webpage and stuff, it's still mostly Navy that are talking to each other. And there was a guy named Albert Moore, and Albert was the head. I think he started the Mobile Riverine Force Association, but he actually lives in Georgia, about 50 miles from here. So I met Albert one time, one-on-one.
And I assume he was Navy.
He was Navy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know the reasons why. I guess the camaraderie of them was probably better at that time because they were living together. They were on little boats together. But our guys, it was like let's get this year over with, you know?
Mm.
And I don't know. There doesn't seem to be a logical reason, because if you took a look at some of the statistical data for the Navy versus the Army, if you compare the Second Brigade to the Navy element of the flotillas, you had almost exactly the same number of men that were killed. I think one of them had 2,500 over the 3-year period, and the other one had 2,600. So they probably saw the same amount of combat.
That's an interesting statistic when you consider, I mean, I am assuming that if you look at the combined elements, the Army guys outnumber the Navy guys, maybe significantly.
Yeah.
But the number of KIAs were the same. So proportionally, the Navy took
Yeah, and I got
a
that
lot of
off
casualties.
there's a web page that tells about, you know, how many KIAs there were by units.
Mm. Wow. Is there anything about, I mean, I know that when you came home, you stayed in the military, so that kind of eased your transition.
Yeah.
Right? You weren't spat out into 1968 America.
No, I wasn't. I stayed. I was a company commander at Fort Benning. I had a company of young men. It was called the NCOC program. And what happened is, if you graduate, it was kind of like an officer candidate program, except when you graduated from my program, you were a non-commissioned officer. You were a sergeant or a staff sergeant.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that for about a year. And then I went to helicopter flight school for 6 months. But midway through that, they found out that I could not see at night. I don't have any night vision. So that kind of washed me out of the helicopter school thing. And then I was assigned to Fort Benning to go to the Infantry Officers Advanced Course. Now, that was 235 men, all of whom were at least captains. We had 1 or 2 majors. All of them had gone to Vietnam. So whenever one guy got up, you knew you were in for a war story of some kind. So those were all guys who had been there once. Some of them had been there twice already.
Yeah, and that's who you're spending your time with.
Yeah.
So that probably helped.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you had shared a very common experience, you know, and there's a brotherhood that occurs like that. You have very formal dinners called dining ins. What I was going to say is that we have a thing in the Army anyway. It was called a dining in, and all of the officers would dress in their dress uniforms. You have a big formal dinner, smoke cigars, drink whiskey, and usually had a very famous guest speaker that came to speak to you. So it built up the camaraderie of the unit and stuff. And then the infantry always had this notation that, you know, that we add color to, otherwise is a dull affair. So, you know, you kind of was the guys that raised a little more hell than everybody else, because you had that reputation. And that did a lot towards the camaraderie.
It sounds like, I mean, do you consider just making a career out of it? It sounds like you were doing really well and you
I
were
did,
really
but
comfortable.
yeah, I was probably on the majors list, but you know, you got to go back to one of the first questions you asked me about: are you going to be? Do you have to have a college degree to be commissioned? All right. Now, when that came back during that period, say 72, 73, Westmoreland came out with notes that said, okay, now we have to go to the colleges and get more college graduates to fill our ranks. So that sent the message out to all of these guys that had gone through the officer candidate school program of saying, look, if I don't have a degree, you know, I'm not going to be able to move much further. And that was the case. That was my understanding. So I was 27. I'd been in 10 years. And my wife and I looked at each other and said, okay, this is going to be kind of rough for a little while, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to go back to school and get college degrees. And initially, our thought was just to get college degrees, but over a 7-year period, Michael, one of us would work full time and go to school part time. The other one would go to school full time and work part time. It took us 7 years, and we both got our master's degree.
Wow. And there was no way for
And
you
I
to,
did most of that on the GI Bill.
got it. Got it. There was no way for you to do that and remain in the military.
There was a very select few that got to go to college, but and this happens, I think, in what I've read about history is any time you have a major conflict, at the end of that conflict, they're going to have a reduction in force, whether it's the enlisted men and their officers or just their officers, but they're going to have a giant, reduction in force and bring the military, because the budget guys and the Congress and stuff are saying we don't need this full-time army right now because we don't have any action going on.
Mm-hmm.
So that was part of the process. You kind of looked over your shoulder all the time to say, okay, am I going to be here next year? How do I plan for it?
Right. Yeah. So you just pull the trigger yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah. What did you study?
I had an undergraduate in business and I got a master's degree in government administration, which is the same thing as an MBA, but it's focused towards government.
Got it. And what did you do with that?
I became a sales manager and a sales vice president for AT&T. And at one point, I was the account manager for all the Navy in the Southeast.
How about that? And what about your wife?
She got an undergraduate in psychology, a master's in business, and went to work for Coca-Cola as an analyst for research.
Okay, now I understand how you ended up in Georgia. You got AT&T, right? Which
Yeah,
which
and
would be Bell South where you are, right?
Yeah,
And Coca-Cola, both
yeah.
right there in Atlanta.
And one interesting aspect on that, Michael, is that she retired after 20 years. She was all of 52. And she said, well, if you don't mind, I'm going to get my doctorate. So she went and got her doctorate and commuted to Gwinnett County and University of Georgia and got her doctorate in education.
Wow. Do you do are you part of any kind of, other than the Mobile Riverine Force Association, do you have any other contact with veterans groups? Are you involved at all?
No, but indirectly, whatever you do, there's going to be some guy who says, "Oh, you're my age. You must have been, or did you go? What unit were you with?" And you got that kind of conversation. I belong to a very active Catholic men's group called the Knights of Columbus, and we do a lot of charity work. But we've actually been involved in a project here in my little town of Douglasville. We built 8 homes for Habitat for Humanity for veterans. It's the second little grouping like that for veterans in the United States. And all 8 homes now has a veteran that lives in it.
That must have felt good.
It felt really good, and it felt that I was giving back, which is, I've had a really blessed life, Michael. I've been very fortunate, great wife, good kids, and I need the ability to give back. And that's where I am in my life right now.
Yeah. Yeah. You haven't mentioned at all any wounds, physical or psychological, from Vietnam? It seems like
I was wounded on a hot LZ on March the 8th, 1968. We came in on a hot LZ, and I'm sure you're familiar with the term, you've heard it, but a bunch of shrapnel and plexiglass came through the back where I was sitting, and I was peppered, and I got a pretty decent cut on my chin. So I went back to the boat. They took all the plexiglass and shrapnel out, gave me a tetanus shot, and I was back out the next day.
Mm. Mm.
Now, as far as psychological, I'm a little bit crazy, but I don't know if I'd have gone that without Vietnam a little bit. I don't, I'm not the kind of guy that lays awake at night and thinks about stuff all the time or has cold sweats. But I think about it. But it's all, it's about people and those who were there and things that happen over time. But it's not mind consuming. It's not all consuming for me. I interact with other guys that I know had similar experiences. But one of the interesting aspects is that probably, and I'm not sure this is a valid statistic, but only about 10 or 15% of the men who went to Vietnam actually saw bullets coming out.
Sure.
A lot, I don't know if that's a good statistic, but I've heard that pretty often. So, you have a different association with those guys than you do with the guys who were, I'm very close to one guy who is a helicopter pilot. and he and I share stories all the time. And but there's a couple of others that were there. One of them was Air Force, and he refueled jet aircraft. And that's fine. He did his tour. He did what he was supposed to, but it's a different experience.
Sure. Sure. Speaking of helicopters, did you ever run into any black ponies or sea wolves or anybody like that?
Yeah, we had sea wolves provide. One of the things that was an interesting aspect and a very big learning experience for me was how, and my forward observer taught me how to do this, was how to interleave different fires. And one of the things that you may not understand or know about is that in the Mobile Riverine artillery, they actually had barges that had 105s on them, and they moved the barges onto the edge of the river. But the interesting is once they fired a shot, that barge would rock and roll. And so they had to shoot another one while it was on the updraft. And that becomes a little scary if you try. But anyway, so as an infantry,
you're talking about 105s, like, is that a howitzer?
yeah, so it's a cannon.
A giant cannon. So
it's sitting on a boat. They each
right.
had a cannon.
So when it fires, the boat rocks.
The boat rocks.
Now the boat is rocking, again. But it has to continue firing?
Yes. But anyway, what I was pointing out to you is you had that. We had helicopters that supported us. We had aircraft that supported us. We had artillery from different locations. And in one case, I think we even had naval gunfire. They had brought a big ship from someplace. So the issue was to learn how to interleave those fires. So if you're shooting artillery, you don't want your helicopters to come in the line of fire. Mm-hmm. And so I had a very good FO who was a friend, and he got killed, but he taught me how to do this, how to watch out and understand how to call one in and hold one back. And that was probably as big a confidence builder with my men when they understood that I could do that for them. Because if you got into a very heavy firefight, you just sat back, lit up a cigarette, and called in all this stuff. There wasn't any sense in throwing bodies against it.
Yeah, I can imagine that's kind of a Rubik's Cube, trying to make all those different layers of fire work together.
Yeah, especially if they're different branches of the military and trying to control it on one call sign.
What was the name of your friend, the forward observer?
It was Kozak, and he was in the 3rd of 34th Artillery.
Have you ever been to the wall, Frank?
No. I will, but I'm going to have to. And in fact, I think we talked a little bit about that, and I've been thinking a lot more about it these days. So it may be that in the very near future I do go back. It's kind of hard. I lost one guy in January the 20th in 1968. That was the first guy I lost. His name was O'Toole. He's a dark-haired, blue-eyed kid of 20. And he died. He was standing on a rice paddy dyke, and somebody ignited a command detonation and blew his leg off and killed him. And I always had thought for a long time, and sometimes I still do today, if I'd have taken a different route or gone a different way, maybe he would still be around. So that was a tough one for me. And then the other one that we really lost was on the April the 8th, where I lost those 8 guys when, the well deck dropped and all of a sudden all sorts of bullets started coming in on the inside.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason I asked is because, you had mentioned the 8 men in this interview, and then you had told me about O'Toole during our pre-interview phone call. But Kozak, you called a friend. Of the men you lost, he's the only one.
But see, he was a fellow. Yeah, he was a fellow officer. And you don't make a lot of friends with your troops, because that's frowned upon, first of all, and then they don't want to do that.
Sure, no, I understand.
They want you in command. They want you in charge. They want to be able to look up to you to help them get out.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to me that a forward observer in the Army is an officer. I know a guy who was a forward observer at Quezon with the Marine Corps. He was enlisted.
Yeah, I don't know how the Marines is on, but we had an FO, and he had a radio operator that was with him. And normally the FO would be with the company commander. And
Gotcha.
that's where he is during the marches or wherever you're going to. But oftentimes they would go for. The other thing is at night before we went to sleep, we put out marking rounds so that you could call out something in the middle of the night if you saw something. Yeah, what happens is you fire an artillery shell that has smoke only in it,
Hmm.
and then you mark that as a round. So if you're getting fire from that during the night where you can't see anything, you can say, okay, this coordinate that I gave you before, and let's say they called it Chevy 2, then shoot at Chevy 2, and they'd already had that in on their thing.
Amazing. Is there anything we haven't talked about, Frank, that you think we should have?
No, I guess the politics of the war kind of bothered me a little bit, and do to this day, I will always feel, and I think a lot of men that went there felt that if they'd unleashed us and allowed us to actually fight and go to North Vietnam, it would have lasted about 2 weeks. But the politics got involved. I think our politicians were very much afraid of the Russians and the Chinese, and prevented a lot of that. And I think you could have prevented a lot of lives lost. So that the political aspect of it is obviously there. I think, there was a lot of misjudgment when they decided to send us there. But once they did, I mean, we were committed and we didn't have much of a choice.
Yeah. Any thoughts or impressions about the enemy that you'd like to share?
Yeah. There were two types that we got. We never really got involved with the actual NBA units, the well-trained army. Ours were mostly Viet Cong who were locals, who had formed little companies together. Much more guerrilla tactics than a straight army, line up against each other and fight. So you had things like little spider holes that they would hide into and pop up and shoot. You had snipers that were pretty good. So you seldom had a very large entity that you were going to go in contact with and go head to head. In fact, once they tried to do that, and that's what Tet was all about, it lasted about 5 days. And after about 5 days, most of the military army units, US and South Vietnamese unit, had gotten back all the momentum they lost. But the public didn't see it that way because it was a giant loss and we weren't used to losing. So, yeah, a lot of respect for the enemy. And it's interesting. I study, Patton was one of my heroes when I learned about military and stuff. And one of the things that he said that always stuck with me, and it worked to my understanding, was there are really only three things if you're going to do combat. One is to know your own men, one is to know the enemy, and the other one is to know the terrain. And in this case, the enemy was pretty good, but they knew the terrain. And our guys were not used to fighting in a jungle, especially at night, where, even at night, if you're in a city, you're going to see a light from somewhere and get some kind of shadow or anything. But if you're in the jungle, there's nothing there. I mean, it's black as your shirt.
Mm.
So those things kind of interested me, or was interested when he said that in the movie Patton about knowing the enemy and knowing the terrain, because the terrain never changes. I mean, they've used things in Europe during World War II called the Fulda Gap that Napoleon used.
Called the what?
It's called the Fulda Gap, Fulda Gap, and it's an avenue of approach that Napoleon used to get into Russia. But Patton ran his tanks through the same area because that Fulda Gap, that gap is still there.
Mm-hmm.